I don't think it was a voice that I acknowledged, but rather it was sort of underneath. Why is this not working for me? It seems to be working for everyone else. Why is this difficult? And what is it telling me? And this was a familiar haunt. I said, okay, rather than going and looking for another employment opportunity, maybe I ought to take some time to do a little soul searching, a little figuring out what I really need.
Hi, and welcome to Feeling Beings Who Think. My name is Ariane Rice, and I am delighted that you are here. Today, I am talking with Leadership Coach Dan Henderson. I'm going to let him tell you more about his professional expertise, but I want to tell you a little backstory on how we met. Last year, I had the privilege and joy of leading a workshop at a Georgetown conference for graduates of the Institute for Transformational Leadership, an alumni gathering focused on learning, networking, and supporting one another in the work we do as coaches, facilitators, and leadership practitioners. My workshop was entitled Being a Vulnerable Coach and Facilitator. Now, I know vulnerability is a word you have heard many times. Thanks to Brené Brown, that word is quite common in our vernacular. However, it's still not something we see modeled often in leadership. And I have discovered over the last decade that vulnerability at work in particular is often reduced to a simplistic understanding about showing an emotion, like crying in a meeting or letting people know when something really upsets you. But vulnerability isn't just one feeling. Vulnerability is an experience of many feelings and emotions all at once, an internal-external mix of excitement, fear, uncertainty, to name just a few. And it always begins with a physical sensation. Sweaty palms, a racing heart, or for me, my telltale sign is a weakness in the knees. And as somebody who has been leading a variety of professional experiences on how we learn to understand and recognize vulnerability and how we cultivate the ability to move through that experience, no matter how many times I speak, no matter the audience or setting, there is always a part of me that does not feel up to the task. There is always a voice that whispers, someone else should be up here. Someone more polished, more expert, more whatever. Implying, of course, that I am always and forever less than. I am confident that you know this feeling too. Thankfully, my guest thoroughly engaged in talking about his experience with that feeling in this conversation. Dan has an incredible range of skills and professional accomplishments, but he was willing to talk with me about one of the most profound realizations in his life that helped him make sense of a way he had felt less than for a long time. And thankfully for us, in this conversation, he openly shares how he moved from seeing that the very thing he'd been so carefully managing and masking was, in fact, his greatest source of connection, belonging, and strength. So as you listen to this conversation, I really want to invite you to reflect on something. What is your thing that you try and manage or keep others from seeing? Because maybe you just haven't allowed yourself to name it and start holding it not as a weakness or something that constantly needs to be improved upon, but as a strength worth embracing and trusting it can be shown to the world. I want to thank Dan for joining me and sharing so generously from his personal and professional experience. And I want to thank you, dear listener, for being here. All right, now let's get to today's conversation. Hey there, Dan Henderson.
Good morning.
Well, welcome to Feeling Beings Who Think. I am so grateful that you reached out after you attended a workshop because we were together at a conference.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really pleased to be here and to have this conversation.
Awesome. Well, Dan and I were talking before I pressed record, and the workshop had a lot to do with vulnerability, and I know Dan's as excited as I am, given that we haven't talked much, to dig into, I don't know, to me, what's the essence of all good conversations, quite honestly.
Yeah, I don't know if it was you, but I think you said in your workshop a turn of phrase that really stuck with me, which is vulnerability is the first thing you look for in someone else and the last thing you want to show in yourself.
Yes.
That was you, right?
Well, that was me sharing Brene Brown's wisdom.
Yeah.
She speaks of the parable, one of the parables of vulnerability. Is that's the first thing you want to see in another person, and it's the last thing you want
Yeah.
to share because it's
Yeah.
scary.
That it is. And that phrase, I've repeated it several times. It really resonated with me. Yeah.
All right. Well, before I ask you what you really don't want to share in this conversation, why don't you introduce yourself and say a little bit about who you are and how you live your vocation in the world?
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm a man in my early 50s. I was raised in a Jewish household in the suburbs of Boston. I have been married for the past 22 years to a woman who is from Louisiana. So we sort of got the whole, Eastern Seaboard span there. Also raised in a Jewish household. We now reside in Falls Church, Virginia, with two teenage daughters and a whole bunch of pets. We love animals, big canine enthusiasts, and all kinds of other small animals. How I live my vocation. Well, I'll sort of give you the nutshell, but there's a story there, as there is for
That's what I want to hear.
most of these things. Right today, I'm a leadership coach and a consultant. And this is relatively new for me, new in the last couple of years. Last year, I finished my coach training at Georgetown's leadership coaching program, which was a deeply meaningful and quite personally transformative experience, and launched into my coaching and consulting practice afterwards in sort of full bore, I guess you could say. I had a little bit before that. And then I am finishing up my coach training currently in coaching neurodivergent learners.
Mm-hmm.
So a big piece of probably today's conversation and how I live my vocation and who I am is that I discovered that I have brain wired differently than most people. ADHD is the term that I'm sure you and many people have heard. I come from a family of many neurodivergent people, as it turns out, all sort of undiagnosed for many years. But my mom with ADHD and probably autism, my sister who is on the autism spectrum, my brother who has ADHD. I did not find out about my own ADHD till about 5 years ago when my now junior in high school daughter was in fifth grade and she was having real trouble with any sort of basic executive functioning around planning. And of course, fifth grade is one of those grades where you start getting into homework assignments that are more than just now. And so we had some neuropsych testing done, and my wife and I are sitting in the office with the psychologist, and he's reading through the report. And at some point, maybe it's a 12-page report. He's 3 pages in. My wife and I look up and say, "Oh my gosh, this is me." So that happened about 5.5 years ago. And that was a really pivotal, extremely pivotal point in my life, because up until then, I didn't really understand myself. I will refrain from making this, more a lecture on what ADHD is, but suffice it to say, it's a brain wiring that is just very different than a neurotypical brain wiring, generally characterized by a lower ability for executive functioning, for planning and focus and attention, and also emotional regulation we'll get into. And so that for me started a period of first relief. Oh my gosh, this is how my brain works. I can look back at my whole life, my schooling, my relationships, my family, everything, my professional life, and put in context what now that I know this about myself, what those periods were like for me and why I behaved certain ways that I did. And then there was a period of grief, and this was a period where I worked with a therapist through, deep feelings of sadness around, oh, had I known
Mm.
then what I know now, or had I known it, earlier, I might have made many different choices and I might have, X, Y, and Z, right? All this sort of just working through all that. And then there is the long period of integration, which is okay. Now that I've my emotions have been seen and nurtured and acknowledged. Now what?
Mm.
And this really is what led me to where I am today in coaching. For years, probably almost 30 years, I was building businesses, mainly technology companies. It felt in retrospect like very neck up work, meaning
Mm-hmm.
very, focusing on my brain and the cognitive and what I probably felt like I should be doing rather than what was really deep inside me or that really played to my strengths.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had a number of different roles as an entrepreneur, as a founding team member, as a venture investor, and eventually running mergers and acquisitions for larger companies. And what that means is, in this case, buying companies on behalf of a larger company. And this integration piece took a long time. And there was a moment in time when it shifted from what I had been doing to maybe I shouldn't be doing this anymore.
Mm. All right. Yes. I want to start even with that term executive function. So, of course, I know the term ADHD just the way most people do. I have people in my life who say, I struggle with ADHD or I've been diagnosed as ADHD. And I continue to want to ensure I fully understand the situation from the perspective of the person talking with me, because it's one of those like words we kind of throw around now, right? So even when you say the term executive functioning, I'm pretty sure I have an idea what that is. And that's a word that sounds like it has a premium in our world, right? Executive is like what we're all supposed to be able to do. It's high level. It's important. It's on a hierarchy of understanding ourselves. That's really, really good.
Mm.
So I want to be sure I understand when you say you are struggling with some of that executive functioning and you recognize that in a conversation around a fifth grader's executive functioning. Can you explain what does that look like?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. What does it look like? Well, if I go back to many years ago, my own experience in fifth grade, the way it all started, or sort of the first example of it that I could really pinpoint, was a social studies project that Mrs. Bleacher assigned. And this was maybe one of the first assignments that involved, multi days or multi weeks. I don't remember how long it was, but I do recall there was an assignment and I sort of uh, put it out of my mind, like, oh, that seems incredibly overwhelming. I'll just ignore it. And I did, and kind of hoped it would go away, and it didn't. And at some point, sort of this came to a head where it was due, it was overdue, it was overdue. And I remember being in Miss Bleacher's office and sort of just breaking down in tears
Mm.
because I didn't know what to do. And she was kind about it. And I eventually sort of buckled down and wrote this report, whatever it was. But that story, there's a lot to unpack in that. But for those of us who live in this world of ADHD, the things that I would point out would be number one, and by the way, whether I'm 10 years old or 20 years old, there was some difference to this experience, but it was functionally the same experience.
Was it feeling the same experience, like the feelings you were having?
It became more complicated as I got older.
Mm.
The feelings, I don't know if you ever saw that wonderful movie Inside Out.
I love that movie. And the second
Yeah.
one too. It's a great
Uh,
movie.
but like when you're a kid, the sort of the inner parts of me were more basic. There were fewer of them. And as I went through adolescence and I became a young adult, they became much more complicated. So the felt experience of this just only became more complex, complicated, and confusing the older I got.
Hmm. Hmm.
And the felt experience was number one, being overwhelmed. And that's so, so, so important because the part of our brain that's responsible for executive functioning is right in the front, the prefrontal cortex. And I am absolutely no neuroscientist. I'm the farthest thing from that, but I've heard this enough, right? And I think a beautiful analogy that I read in a book called Your Brain's Not Broken by Dr. Tamara Rosier was that for neurotypical people, there's a little butler voice in your head that says, hey, don't forget to do that thing. Hey, you've got that assignment. You should probably start spending some time working on this piece and this piece and this piece. And those of us with decreased executive functioning, amongst many other potential feelings, we don't really have that voice. That voice is either completely mute or very, very quiet.
Mm.
And so that sort of is the first piece of feeling overwhelmed, which is there's no compassionate voice or even organized voice in our head saying, hey, if you do start this, you probably want to start it early, now, and here's something you might start with. None of that exists.
Well, and sorry to interrupt, but also the feeling of overwhelm it's a particular feeling. I mean, some of us, like myself in fifth grade, when we were told some big project like that, the voice was also like, yay, here I get to shine, right? Like here I can do something to try and prove myself,
Mm.
and meet and please the teacher. I had a big voice around pleasing the teacher and the parents with that grade. So it occurred to me that you use that word overwhelm, and that's a very particular feeling.
Yes. And I would say that's a word you can take to the bank for
Mm.
most people with ADHD because it might be overwhelmed from some project that we need to do and we just have zero idea how to start. It could be overwhelmed from a sensory point of view. A lot of us, including myself, have low sensory thresholds.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, sound and noise can really make me feel incredibly bothered and activated in a sort of a very negative way. I've read stories about people who heat can do this. Get into a hot car on a summer day, and then that heat just absolutely angers them and drives them nuts. So a lot of sensory and feels around anything
Mm-hmm.
in our environment. So okay, so there's the feeling of overwhelm, and then there's a feeling of in the overwhelm, I don't even know where to begin. So I'll just ignore this thing. I just won't do it. I'll just hope it goes away. And then the flip side of that is many of us, including myself, develop a adaptation on for how to do these sort of long-term assignments or whatever is required of us. And the adaptation, instead of using a butler, uses the limbic center of our brain, which is the emotional center of our brain. And that generally ends up being a negative emotion. Like, oh my God, if you don't do that, you're going to fail this. And, blah, blah, blah. And I think I call it the panic choir is sort of
Yeah.
my
Oh,
own
that's
term,
great.
my own term for it. And that is something, and I'll be really open here. That panic choir is something that has followed me my entire life to this age. And it's still something that I sort of have to acknowledge and deal with.
Well, I'm curious, are you positive intelligence and positive psychology? And I remember one of the helpful things I took away from my exposure to that was always remember those panic choirs. They're trying to help you and protect you. So is part of your understanding with it now, trying to, since it's still going to be with you, like, how do I talk to it? How do I acknowledge it? How do I conceptualize it?
Absolutely. Yeah, so much, so much. How do I embrace it? How do I thank it? Thank you for all the
Mm.
service you've given me for all these years. And now I have other tools.
Yeah.
And so you can take a break, you know.
Well, and I'm also really curious around the sensory component, given that you're a musician.
Gosh, great question. I'll start by saying this. There's no such thing as background music for me. I don't know if that resonates with
It
you.
does, because I can't, I mean, if I'm working, I cannot have music on at all.
Yeah, absolutely not. The second thing I'll say is I didn't realize there were really lyrics or stories in songs until I was an adult
Oh my
because
gosh.
I only heard the music. So I grew up with two siblings, an older sister and a younger brother, all of us with our own various versions of brain wiring that was completely unknown. This is in the 70s and the early 80s, completely unknown and undiagnosed at the time, and all of us were musicians. And it's highly usual for people with ADHD to be creative. This happens to be generally, everyone's different, of course, but one of our strong characteristics. And so whether it's painting or music or science or even starting a company, there's a lot of creativity that runs in my people. So anyway, so I grew up in this household and we all played classical music together. And again, I've read enough about neuroscience to know that when you start playing music when you're young, there's certain areas of your brain that develop more than others, and so they tend to be bigger and wider. And that's about all I know. Um, so looking back, it's no surprise that when I listened to rock songs or pop songs of the era, it was the progression that I was hearing. It was the chords, it was the music, and feeling emotions around those, but never being able to discern what the lyrics were. Even
Hmm.
if you paid me, I couldn't even listen and tell you what a song is about because my brain processing wasn't able to do that.
But you mentioned that you grew up in a Jewish family and household. Was it Jewish in terms of an identity and a religious identity, or were you practicing? Were you part of a faith community?
It was both. It was both. I would say, we all had our bar and bar mitzvahs and we went to synagogue on the high holidays. So, it was, it had the structure of both practicing and identity. Although I don't know that the faith in how I interpret what faith is today for me was part of the picture.
Well, I'm curious too about the music aspect of that tradition and the cantor and how you heard that when you were in that kind of setting.
Yeah, I appreciate that question. It's actually something I never considered back then. I can say now that going to synagogue and listening to the cantor chant and the synagogue that I go to, it's been women, it's both men and women. That was not the case growing up in a conservative Jewish synagogue in Boston, is deeply spiritual and meaningful and beautiful to me, and often brings me to tears.
Because that music is different than what you hear in pop music. Do you hear the words in that situation? Can you hear what's being said? Is it connected?
Ah, well, it's in Hebrew, and my
Right.
my Hebrew is pretty limited. So really, probably again, it's the music.
Right.
Yeah,
Because the language becomes part of the music since it's in some
yeah,
ways unintelligible. Right. Yeah.
that's exactly right. Yeah,
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of people, when we listen to classical or something that's maybe in a religious category, it's not about the words so much as there's a comfort both with a feeling of familiarity and also with the spiritual quality and spiritual music.
yeah. Yeah, and even there's a crossover between classical and Jewish music in with composers like Max Bruch, who wrote this absolutely gorgeous piece called Kol Nidre. Kol Nidre is a traditional and very important prayer that is chanted during Yom Kippur, which is
Mm-hmm.
our most holy day of repentance. So anyway, in synagogue for the last number of years, there's been a cellist who plays this, and my brother, who's a cellist now, a professional cellist, played this growing up in our synagogue. So there's sort of a blending, just on the subject of music and religion. There's a blending in my mind between classical and the music that I grew up with in the synagogue.
Mm-hmm. So how does someone who, I mean, you were successful. You were a successful person in your work and in your world. And then all of a sudden, I picture you now in this room with your wife and your daughter and this person behind a desk with this, and, and you have this epiphany. I mean, that's how I took it in.
Yeah.
How were you able to be successful? How were you able to navigate getting stuff done? Because you got stuff done.
Right. So I subsequently went on after that experience to take this neuropsych test myself, which was this big, long 3-4 hour deal. And what it revealed was that I have, not surprisingly, at the time I was in my mid 40s, I had developed over decades many compensatory measures and adaptations. And so examples of that would be an intense adherence to calendaring, setting alarms, note taking, almost to like a, how do you say this? Like, I would use various programs to keep any kind of notes that I made about anything in my family. It could be, insurance related. It could be family memories. It could be anything, but I would sort of collect it all and archive it. So I guess I became sort of an obsessive archiver because, and again, not knowing, but because didn't I didn't feel that I could rely on my memory. Another really classic or really common thing with those of us with ADHD is low working memory, which is sort of that forgetfulness that people might tease around people with ADHD. Oh, I forgot my phone. I forgot this. I left that. I don't have my power cord. I totally forgot about this meeting. I mean, all this kind of thing. So, yeah, so I developed systems, very rigid systems.
This is a personal question, which you can take it or leave it, but I'm curious about, we attract people to help us with some of our deficits, right? So I'm curious about, because you've been married a long time.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I'm happy to address this. It's
Yeah,
been
I mean, so the question is, has this epiphany revealed itself with the two of you? I don't know. Yeah, I think you heard the question. I was not entirely articulating.
so the troubles really started when we had kids 16 years ago. And by troubles, I mean the way I had adapted to live my life up until that point. I think I was 35 when I had my first child, so a little bit older. All of that fell apart because, as anyone who has kids know, going from no kids to a kid is an enormous shift and or transformation for both parents, and it just brings up so much. And looking back, there was not only the sleep deprivation that is typical of having a young child, but then there was in retrospect, the breakdown of my system. It didn't work anymore. And I didn't know what was going on. My wife didn't know what was going on. All she knew was she was doing a lot of the diaper changes and all this other stuff. And I was just trying to, like, in retrospect, hold on for dear life and continue to try to be effective at work and, and just sort of be effective. And so this continued. We had a second child a couple of years later, and fast forward to when we were sitting in that room and I had this realization. We both had this realization that, oh my gosh, this is me. That was the beginning of a lot of work and integration that ultimately has brought us to a place that is much richer and much better than at any point since we had kids. And I would argue even before that, because look, all of us are, every 5 years, like you could say on average, we're different people.
Yep.
Every 2 years, we're always in transition mostly as humans. And so we're so different than we are so different now than we were then. And this work ultimately has allowed me to just be in touch with myself. Who am I? How do I lean into what I'm good at and what my strengths are? And that has only helped me to be, a more present dad and a more supporting spouse and all these things that I would love to be, but I wasn't really able to for a long time.
What was the story you were telling yourself then? Well, so one of the stories that when I'm picturing or picturing myself in something similar, my story would be, I'm not normal. Something's wrong with me. I'm curious what your story was around all that, or if you had one.
Yeah, boy, I really appreciate you being vulnerable and sharing that because it reminded me of something I probably was feeling and denying, which was a feeling of why isn't this working for me? Like, and by this I mean work, life. Like, I don't think it was a voice that ever I acknowledged or really sat with, but rather it was sort of underneath. Why is this not working for me? It seems to be working for everyone else. Why is this hard, so difficult? And so that not acknowledging that led to all sorts of distracting behaviors, anything I could to sort of numb out or focus on something else. But yeah, I think that was a real through line. And that actually leads up to the moment where I realized I sort of felt like maybe I need to look into this coaching thing because I had reached what I would have then considered the pinnacle of my career as a business person, right? Running M&A for a private equity backed technology services company and acquiring businesses and making good money and all this sort of stuff. After that business was acquired by a very large private equity company. That private equity company brought in their own mergers and acquisitions team and basically said, thank you, we don't need you anymore because we've got our own people to do this. And that was a moment where I sort of paused and felt, okay, this feeling of not being enough, of not feeling like I've really hit my stride is surfacing. And what is it telling me? And this was a familiar haunt, right? I had felt this feeling throughout all kinds of different professional experiences. And this was the first time because of my stage of life, because knowing how my brain works and all kinds of other things, I sat down and I said, okay, rather than going and looking for another employment opportunity, maybe I ought to take some time to do a little soul searching,
Hmm.
a little figuring out what I really need next. Yeah.
I'm just curious if you could say more about that feeling of not enoughness and the becoming aware that you wanted to explore it versus fill it, deny it, get rid of it.
Mm,
Why do you think you wanted to explore it?
yeah. That is a wonderful question. It feels hard to describe. I'll do my best. There was a feeling of not being enough throughout my entire life. And a lot of this does come back to the ADHD because those of us who grew up with a sort of a hidden different brain wiring, and I really resist calling it a disability, although it shows up as a disability in a world that's not designed for us. We receive many implicit negativity from parents, from teachers, from our colleagues, from our peers, because we're different, and so we do our best to mask. But the like day after day, week after week, year after year, all those negativity really traumatizes
Hmm.
us. And so we grow up sort of like death by a thousand cuts. We grow up with all these thousands of little negative sentiments towards us, and it makes us feel bad about ourselves. And so this persists throughout my whole life, this feeling of I'm just not enough. And I'm not enough as a husband. I'm not enough as a professional. I'm not enough as a father. I'm not as enough as a friend. It's just it's a horrible yoke to have around my neck. And something happened between the time where I had this discovery that my brain works a very different way than I thought it did. And that 1 or 2 year period when I found myself in this position saying, wow, maybe I need to step back. And it was and around surrounding that moment was this feeling of not feeling enough. And then maybe for the first time, having a moment of recognizing that and then thinking, well, maybe that's not the whole story.
Mm.
Maybe there's more there. And that's what ultimately led me to say to my wife, hey, I think I need to spend a few months sort of digging into having conversations with people in this world of coaching that seems really exciting to me and just exploring. And are you okay with that? And she was very supportive. And then within 2, 3 months, I think I had had conversations with a dozen plus coaches, many from the Georgetown coaching program, where ultimately I went and did my training. And I remember turning to Bethany and saying, I found my calling.
Mm.
And I'm getting emotional just even thinking about it, because it was a sense of these are my people. And I didn't know I had these people, but here they are. And that sense has continued, 2.5 years later, when I'm in a room of coaches or a coaching conference where I met you. I have this deep sense of this is my tribe.
Yep.
And it's a
I'm,
wonderful, beautiful feeling.
I so resonate, and I had kind of thought I had found my calling as a priest. And lo and behold, it's about being in the space of adults who want to explore feelings connected with thinking, connected with working, being, and recognizing that this image we're sold about what success is, we might achieve it. It means absolutely nothing if our insides are empty, confused, and certainly if we're feeling like we're not enough.
Yeah.
So did somebody recommend a coach? How was the connection made for you?
So right around the time that I had received my own ADHD diagnosis 5+ years ago, I actually hired a coach and did some work with him and realized that my progress with him from a sort of a business coaching point of view was really being hampered by some other deeper things. And this is the period where I was going through sort of the relief and the grief around the ADHD diagnosis. So, excuse me, ultimately I paused working with that coach and went to therapy at that point. There's
Can I ask one question about the grief? I'm sorry.
Of course, yes, of course.
So I just am curious around that. I'm trying to figure out how to say the question. When we become an adult and we realize we learn something about ourselves that really is a learning and kind of explains ourselves to ourselves, there's a part of me that wants to get really mad and upset at my parents who couldn't figure that out for me when I was dependent on them. And so I'm curious if that's connected with your grief.
Yeah. Oh, such a great question. I think had I learned about my ADHD as a young adult, there might have been more of a anger, resentment, tendency to blame my parents. But then I think because I found out later in life, I was able to pretty immediately contextualize the fact that in my household growing up, which was really chaotic, given 3 neurodivergent siblings, a neurodivergent mom, and a dad who was loving and kind and gone a lot because he was working in sort of the mode of that, that time. That as a parent now of 2 neurodivergent kids, I just have so much, I just can't even imagine. Well, I can't imagine, but it's really hurts me to imagine how difficult it was for my parents, and especially my mom, because raising 3 neurodivergent kids in a time that wasn't so far away from the time where women were pretty much blamed for anything that was anything that was wrong with the kids, it was somehow the mom's fault. And I just felt like, oh gosh, what a raw deal that was. So yes, it caused trauma, and I've worked through that as an adult. And also I have a lot of empathy for what my parents went through, not knowing what they didn't know.
Were they alive when you found your I mean, were you able to talk with them about this?
Yeah. Yeah. And they're alive. And so we've had lots of discussions around this.
So let's go back into that. You found the coach, you decided to go do deeper work.
Right. And then just randomly at the time, a gentleman who was consulting to the company where I was at the time had just finished the coaching program at Georgetown. And it's so funny, Arian. I remember thinking, boy, that's kind of part of me was sort of intrigued with what he did. And the other part of me is sort of this, well, I guess more inauthentic, manufactured sort of business part of me was like, well, that sounds a little woo-woo,
Yeah.
I don't know about that, I don't know why he'd want to go be a coach or do this. I don't know. It just seemed like kind of a little foreign to me. But he is one of the first people that I went back to several years later when I was doing my soul searching a couple of summers ago. And I called him up and his name's Robert. And I said, hey, Robert, I'd love to hear more about this coaching program that you went through, because the one thing that he had mentioned was it wasn't for him a training where you sort of learn about the rubrics and the models and you do practice. It was really about going deep and
Hmm.
inner work and doing that with other people. And that's really what intrigued me. A big piece of what I had been missing my whole life was this sort of limiting belief that I can do it alone. Right? There's this I don't need other people, and that was absolutely came as a protective mechanism when I was a child, and I needed to just figure things out for myself because I didn't have the support structure that was optimal. And probably about 5 or 6 years ago is where it started to dawn on me that I can't do this alone, whatever this is,
Hmm.
really become who I am. I just need help. I need community. I need other people around me.
Yep.
And so this idea of spending 6 months going deep with a group of people just really intrigued me. So that was kind of the seed. I talked to a couple of other OD consultants that I had met along the way, and I had always been attracted to that kind of work of of helping people become the most part of the most effective teams that they can,
Hmm.
right? Because I've still got, after all these years, quite a developed business mind, and I know how important that is in executing any plan, is having a team that really works. I think another thing that I really wanted to bring into this conversation is I have really big emotions, and this is a well known fact of the way a lot of people with ADHD experience the world. And it even has a term, emotional hyperarousal. But essentially what it means is I feel anger, pity, disgust, joy, delight, all the emotions that a neurotypical person feels throughout any given day, but much bigger. And this is the only way I know, because I have never been any other way. So it is just my entire felt experience is having these enormous emotions. But once it became to understand that people go through the world not feeling huge emotions all the time, that really was the jumping off point for me of understanding myself a lot better.
Okay, wait, I want to just ask a question here. So recently I've been reflecting about the way we categorize emotional quantities within ourselves in that way. And I am just curious to know, when you say someone who feels powerfully, feels strongly, do you think part of the fact that you're describing it as big is because we simply live in a world that doesn't really allow for a lot of time for people to actually sit with and be present to the feelings they're actually having, but also a vocabulary that helps them even notice and name the feeling they're specifically having? I'm curious a little bit about how are you and I to judge what a
Hmm.
big emotion is? Because maybe in the business world of consulting, things will be perceived as bigger types of feelings because that's not an environment where feelings are prominently supposed to work. But certainly in the working world I lived in a congregational setting, in a church, feelings there happen, more readily.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Does that make sense, that question?
Yeah, I receive that as a place of curiosity. What
Yeah.
makes these,
Yeah.
what
What
makes you,
is a big feeling? What does that
what is it,
mean?
what does it mean? Okay, so I'll give you an example. A coworker gives you a compliment and you think, oh, hey, that's really nice. Thanks. Maybe puts a lift in your step. That's scenario A. Scenario B is a coworker gives you a compliment and you are so overjoyed by it. You go home that night thinking about it. The next day you wake up thinking about that compliment. It comes up for you
Wow.
sometime the next day or two or three.
Okay.
There's another example. Your boss says something kind of critical. And one scenario is you go, oh, whoa, that stung. All right, what is he talking about or she? What do I need to learn from this? How do I respond to this? But that really doesn't feel very good. Scenario B, where I live, is, oh my gosh, the world is falling apart.
Mm.
I don't know what that means. What did she or he mean by this? It could have meant this, this, and this. Story A, story B, story C, story D, story E, all at once. Can't really focus on work that day, can't focus on work the next day, constantly distracted by this thing, and
Mm.
day three and day four. So in the professional environment, that's one way that big
I
feeling.
got it. And when you're talking about it also sounds like it's a cognitive distraction too. Like you're creating a lot of stories very rapidly, all consuming in your brain.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, one of the strengths of people with ADHD is that we generally lean on a nonlinear, the part of our brain that is nonlinear, that is what's called divergent thinking. And what that means is for us, all the ideas can pop up all at once and far outpace our ability to communicate them effectively.
Mm.
And this is both this and the emotional hyperarousal are really well documented. But I will say this, even in the DSM today, which is sort of the medical diagnostic
Mhm.
manual, ADHD is really only described as impulsivity, hyperactivity. You have few of these things. Whereas over the last 10 or 20 years, practitioners in the space, like I mentioned, Dr. Tamara Rosier, who wrote this wonderful book, Your Brain's Not Broken, for the last decade or two, a handful of people have been doing a lot of coaching and therapy in this space. And there's so much more than just this tip of the iceberg. And big emotions is one of them. And so reading her book and learning that I'm not the only one really made me feel seen. And I think the other side of that is because creativity is such a hallmark of people with ADHD, I think we can all sort of recognize the quote unquote artist personality. Oh, they're an artist, and
Yeah.
what does that mean? It's someone who is so deeply fixated on something they're passionate about that everything else disappears. They must create that painting, they must play that music, or they must do that performance art. They must focus on that chemistry that they are absolutely obsessed with. And that hyper focus sort of to me goes hand in hand with those big emotions. We
Mm.
we have an interest-based brain wiring. So the things that we are interested in doing light us up in a way that allows us to just go deep and fast. And conversely, the things that don't interest us, the phrase pulling teeth to do them doesn't do it justice.
Hmm.
But that's what it's like going through a world where you have to do this thing and that thing, and it's just pulling teeth. I mean, there were things I would rather have had my teeth pulled than do, this assignment or that thing.
Yeah.
So dreadfully, awfully uninteresting.
Yeah. No, even your energy talking about being at that level. And that's exactly what I had been thinking of around music. Because when you're in that
Mm,
zone of making music with your instrument, it's using all of you. You're completely in something,
totally.
right? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, did you know when you started coaching that you wanted to work in this neurodivergent space, or was that like, oh, wait a second?
Yeah, not at all. That
Oh,
that that emerged on its own. I met an ADHD coach through a coaching coffee, and I said, "Whoa, tell me about this." I have ADHD, and she said, "So do I." So we started chatting and getting to know one another. And she said, "You could really be a great ADHD coach, especially given what you know of yourself and your business background, your coaching training." And at the moment, I thought, "Oh, that's an interesting idea." And it kind of planted a seed. And so what I then did is I went and started sort of going down the rabbit hole on the YouTube and, listening to TED Talks from people talking about this and kind of getting a sense of what was out in the universe about ADHD. And I had a moment where I was listening to a woman, I think her name is Jessica McCabe, I may be butchering that, who has a YouTube channel. And she was talking about her own evolution, having ADHD and spinning up this channel and being surrounded by her people. And what a wonderful gift it was. And I had this moment where where I immediately felt reviled, like, ooh, I wouldn't want to hang out with people with ADHD. And then a nanosecond later, I was like, whoa, what was that? Because I'm someone with ADHD. So that was sort of a moment, maybe in the last year where I realized, okay, there's something there. If I'm not able to accept who I am, really, truly, and want to hang out with a bunch of people like me, what's going on? So that sort of led to some inner work that then led to my realizing I have a real deep passion of course, for helping people, because that's in the coaching profession. We love to help people sort of grow, but specifically those who maybe are later in life, were diagnosed, have not done the integration, and are living in the pain that I lived in. And that became really clear to me that I was really passionate about helping those people. So now about a third of my coaching clients are, adults with ADHD, professionals, business leaders, owners, entrepreneurs, owners who are trying to figure out what it means for them.
Your story of that, you've used a couple times in our conversation, this was my thing. And I just want to highlight the beautiful connection with how our power of vulnerability works in us is when we recognize whatever our this is that we feel shame around. And all of us have at least one, if not multiple thises. The last thing we want to do is be in communities where our this is shared. And then at the same time, the minute we get curious about that and find ourselves in those communities, then that connection is what dissipates the shame. And we realize like, oh, this is my superpower. This is, I heard somebody say, when you put out those good vibes, you find your tribe. Like it's the vibes that create the tribe.
Yeah. Isn't that true?
Mm-hmm.
And just to follow up on that, since then, I have now created my social circle of those of us, other coaches, other professionals who have ADHD. And it's been beautiful because we can sit and have lunch or go out to a show together and all feel deeply comfortable knowing that if one of us has a huge drop in energy, which is very common, or gets bored or is super excited about something, it's all fine. This is kind of a fun one. You'll be having a conversation with three of my friends who have ADHD, and it's okay that we make huge leaps from one topic to another, to another, to another, because all of us are either okay with it, because that's how our brains like basically function, or we see the connection and it's fine. We don't have to wait for a sort of a linear deductive conversation, which is how we accommodate the rest of the world around us, or we've learned to.
So as I'm noticing the time and wrapping up, what do you want to say are the voices that someone who might be listening to this conversation and wanting to explore more? What are some of the questions you want to offer as places where you can be generously and compassionately curious with your own self? And then also how people connect with you.
Well, maybe I'll start backwards because that's easier. So people can connect with me certainly by email or visiting my website. The name of my organization is Gravity Insights. So I can be reached at dan@gravityinsightsgroup.com. You can also just go to my website, gravityinsightsgroup.com, and send me an email through the form there. So that's easy. And I welcome any conversation from any of the listeners about any part of this, because I know we've covered a lot. I am drawing a little bit of a blank, and maybe I could ask you to ask.
Sure. So here's a simpler way. Sometimes we need some help knowing it's okay to ask for help. How do you let people know How do you let your clients know it's okay to ask for help?
Yeah. I think, well, so most of the time that my clients have come to me, they're in some sort of pain.
Mm,
So they're sort of at the point where they're like, okay, I need help. I would say for those who are hearing this podcast and thinking, I wonder if I have a little ADHD, quote unquote, or if this could be me or some of this really resonates, of course, feel free to reach out. There is a beautiful community of those of us who have ADHD and are doing professional activities and coaching in the ADHD space. There's conferences that are put on for people like us and who serve people like us. There are YouTube channels. There are wonderful books and what I would throw out there is, for me, my experience has been all of this has served to make me feel seen and in a way that is like deeply emotional. Like, wow, I've never really been seen before. So, if a listener feels that, I would be honored to connect you, listener, into this community.
beautiful. Thank you. Thank you, Dan, for really sharing generously and so personally and professionally, of course. I really appreciate, I've learned a lot in this conversation, and I'm really grateful. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm grateful for the opportunity and for you and that you do this podcast and ask these questions. It's been a real special experience. Thank you.